So this is a pretty interesting graphics card. First of all, it's the only hybrid cooled 4090 on the market. So you've got this liquid cooler here for your GPU and your memory, and then you've got this fan back here for your VRM and your power delivery. Second of all, it's the first kind of AIO based GPU that I've seen from MSI. It's the first hybrid card that I've seen from them as well. So it'll be interesting to see what they've come up with here. And third of all, the value that you're getting here is actually pretty good. Now, of course, the RTX 4090 is pretty expensive, starting at $1,600 US for the Founders Edition, and then you've got the partner cards, which are typically landing around that $1,700 to $1,800 mark. This, surprisingly, is kind of within that range. It's around that $1,800 mark, which, I mean, factoring in this liquid cooling solution that you've got here, that's actually pretty good. Because if you wanted to slap a water block on a 4090, I mean, you're easily over the $2,000 mark already. And that's without fittings, without a radiator, without tubing or coolant. You know, custom liquid cooling can get very expensive. So if you were planning on getting a 4090 and just liquid cooling it anyway, definitely consider this as an alternative, because in terms of value, it's looking pretty good. And in one way, this AIO solution here is maybe kind of superior to liquid cooling a 4090 in a full custom loop, because this 240mm radiator is only for the GPU. Like, this is not also heating up your CPU by 10, 15, maybe even 20 degrees C, because remember, the effectiveness of liquid cooling is primarily dependent on the temperature of the coolant. And with the 4090 pumping out as much heat as it does, yeah, you're going to see some pretty significant increases in that coolant temperature, a lot more significant at least compared to what you might be experiencing with a 3080 or a 2080 Ti, for example. So having this completely separate radiator solution for the 4090, I think is pretty interesting, pretty viable for a GPU of this much power as well. And that coupled with the amount of, you know, value that you're getting for a liquid cooled GPU, and just this amount of like cooling stuff compared to just like most partner cards, which are a massive heatsink and 3 fans. Yeah, I think we're off to a pretty good start. Now, something else that's pretty good is the design. Now, I think we'd all agree MSI have been, you know, slowly cleaning up their design language of their graphics cards, and what we have here is probably their cleanest graphics card design to date. I mean, it helps that there's no big massive heatsink that's protruding here or like a ton of RGB. But yeah, massive thumbs up to MSI. What we have here is just like a really, really clean design from them, but it's also unique to their design language. I appreciate that. You've got this brushed metal faceplate on the front, which is pretty nice, and that matches the back plate as well. And the colors overall are pretty neutral. Another thing that I noticed was that the cable that runs from the radiator fans to the card itself is completely hidden, which is nice. So there's no cable stretching between the GPU and the radiator. I think other AIO and hybrid cards have also done this, and it's pretty normal, but yeah, just a nice detail I thought I'd point out. In terms of dimensions, the card is, you know, relatively compact. It's 2 slots in thickness, as you'd hope for a liquid cooled model. Length isn't too bad at 280mm, but the width of the card is probably what you'd want to consider, if anything. That's 140mm, but realistically it's more like 170 to 180mm once you also factor in the tubing and the power connector. Speaking of which, it uses the same quadruple 8-pin adapter that plugs into the 16-pin connector, so it's the exact same as the 4090 FE, or of course you could just use a single Gen 5 cable if your power supply supports that. So the visual design of the card is great, but what is this? I mean, surely we have to subtract a few points for the unevenness of the sticker application here. And the funny thing is, all 3 fans on this card are uneven. So when the fans spin up, you get this weird wobbly effect. And I find it pretty amusing actually that we've got this, you know, extremely complex device here. Billions and billions of transistors and just mind-blowing GPU development, and the cooling development as well is no slouch at all. But then the stickers on the fans are, you know, installed unevenly, and I don't know who's to blame here. I don't know if like someone is, you know, about to get fired, or if there's like a robot that needs calibration. In the end, you can just take the stickers off and remount them properly in the middle like they should be. Now, speaking of fans, you've got this 95mm fan at the back here, which cools the VRM, and it does that by pushing air all the way through the card and out the back near the IO, pretty much like a blower fan. Here's an idea of what that looks like under the hood. So all of the power stages, all of the capacitors, capacitors and the inductors are cooled actively by that fan. And then you've got a cold plate in the pump block for the GPU, which also extends out to the memory. In terms of performance, don't expect any massive differences in terms of frame rate or clock speeds versus the Founders Edition or any other cards. The Suprim Liquid X on the right here typically runs about plus 30 megahertz and plus 30 to 50 watts over the FE, and that meant that the gains in FPS are really next to nothing. That means that most of the time you're running at 2690 megahertz and closer to that 400 watt mark. Now this is no fault of this card or MSI. Again, we're comparing this to the NVIDIA Founders Edition, which is already fairly juiced up, and NVIDIA have developed it quite a lot. It seems that over the years as well that there just isn't much headroom given to board partners in terms of what additional power and clocks they're allowed to plug in, not just for this card, but expect these kind of results for really any aftermarket card out there. And the same goes for overclocking. I mean, this is mostly going to come down to the GPU silicon quality and not like the VBIOS implementation or the PCB design. NVIDIA locked the voltage slider for overclocking a couple of generations ago, so my overclocking results here are almost identical to what I was able to achieve on the Founders Edition. Plus 190 MHz on the core clock, which lands us slightly under 3 GHz, and a plus 1700 MHz offset on the memory. So you're gaining about plus 8% on average here at 4K, and increasing the power draw by 40 to 50 watts. The real difference is when it comes to cooling performance. So the FE card on the left here, and then MSI's Liquid card on the right, both running Firmark, and the room ambient today was a little bit warmer at 24 degrees. In the end, we're looking at the GPU temp sitting under 60 for the Liquid cooled card, which makes it over 10 degrees cooler than the Founders Edition. That's also while operating at a slightly lower fan speed and a slightly higher GPU clock and power. In the end, here's what they both sound like out of the box. Also, I will note there is a VBIOS switch here on the MSI Suprim Liquid X to switch between two profiles. One is gaming and one is silent, but as far as I can see, they don't do anything different. Even after a full system restart, the power and clock performance was the same on both, which was a bit odd. It is possible though that it's just my review unit and the other profile was not flashed. So cooling performance is actually quite good for a 240mm, liquid cooled card, especially when it's running a 4090, which can boost up to 450 watts. That considering temperatures under 60 are quite good. Although, do keep note that we have tested on an open test bench here, which is like extremely favorable when it comes to radiator testing, because you've just got this infinite amount of airflow. Well, not infinite, it's a pretty small room, which did heat up a little bit, but compared to the small amount of volume that you've got in like a mid-tower case, open bench testing is definitely a lot more favorable. Which leads me to my next point, which was just the amount of heat that was coming out of this radiator. I mean, I've built a lot of custom loops in my time, a lot of compact custom loops as well, where the heat density is quite insane. But I've never felt anything in terms of the heat being dumped outside of a radiator like what we had here with the Suprim Liquid X. I mean, just to put it as plainly and simple as possible, if you're going to be putting this in a mid-tower case, maybe don't put it at the front where it's going to be dumping a lot of the heat inside the case and then going through your components like your CPU tower air cooler or your CPU radiator, for example. If you're going to be top mounting it and exhausting it, the temperatures are going to be, a few degrees warmer because the intake temperature, you're going to be taking air through the case rather than through the front of the case, which is going to be cooler. But as a result, you're not then going to be transferring all of that heat through your components. So, there's going to be a bit of a trade-off there. I think that, top mounting it, exhausting the air is probably going to be the best. But if you do end up picking this card, it might even be worth playing around with a couple different setups to see what works best. Now, there is another AIO-based 4090 on the market from Gigabyte, which is called the Waterforce. That is actually a full coverage block, so it cools the VRM via liquid cooling as well, and it uses a 360mm radiator instead of a 240 that we have here. But it's really up to you in what you're after. I do think there are some advantages of a smaller radiator radiator. Some cases won't be able to run another 360, like especially if you're already running a 360mm cooler on your CPU. I haven't reviewed that model yet, so not too sure on the performance, but that is another model that you'd want to consider and check the reviews on. So I will leave this one linked down below, of course. I will also be doing a build with it very soon in a mid tower that is unreleased, but I will be showing you at the end of this month, so be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. As always, huge thanks for watching. I will see you all in the next one.